Starting with question number 1, I have my Substack if you want the details for it. 2 questions, they're both the same patient. It's a young man who's 25. He comes to you with a 6-month history of bloody diarrhea and feeling very tired. So you recommend him to go see a gastroenterologist, and the gastroenterologist performs a colonoscopy and sees abnormalities. And then some biopsies were taken from these areas as well as some areas that looked a little bit more normal. Everything ties together with a diagnosis of Crohn's. Before he had his colonoscopy, he had some lab work done. So let's start with the blood work. Red blood cell count's low, 4.5 million cells per microliter. So that is actually abnormal. It's low for a man. So a man should have about 4.7 million cells per microliter or higher. And not only that, the size of his red blood cells, they are small. So I put the MCV, or mean corpuscular volume, here as 75 femtoliters. We want to have a normal range between 80 and 100. So the size is low, the number is too few, and then overall the hematocrit, which I don't think I've talked about on my channel here, it's 33%, which is low. We want to have 40% or higher. If you drew some blood, put it in a tube, and you spun it around really, really quickly, all the red blood cells would drop to the bottom of the tube, and that would be your hematocrit. It's the percent of space that they take up in blood. So it's taking up less space. He has too few blood cells and they are too small. So we have an anemia. No one actually chose normal for his lab work, which is correct because this is not normal. He's anemic, so we can toss that answer out. We can throw out B12 and folate deficiency because they would be larger red blood cells. 4 people voted for iron. So let's go back to the colonoscopy. So I wanted to mention, because we haven't talked about this much, in Crohn's we have bleeding. Our patient had a bloody diarrhea. We have all this bleeding out of the intestines, and if we're bleeding, then we're also losing red blood cells. And if you're thinking like, well, why doesn't the patient's bone marrow just make new red blood cells? It's not quite that simple, because with the red blood cells that we lose the iron in them. So we need that iron to make new red blood cells, and a red blood cell lasts 120 days. So at the end of its 120-day life, it's going to get recycled by these cells in the spleen called macrophages. So they're going to chew up the red blood cells, break everything down, but they're going to recycle that iron. And it's so mind-boggling when you think about this. We recycle 200 billion red blood cells per day, but we don't have to worry because normally we make the same exact amount. So that's 200 billion red blood cells made every single day. So there's this nice balance. To make red blood cells, to make that amount, we need 18 milligrams of iron. But at the same time, we recycle the same amount, so we're recycling 18 milligrams of iron. So everything seems pretty balanced. However, we lose about 1 milligram of iron per day normally without even trying. A man will lose 1 milligram per day, and that's just by his skin shedding. So skin cells shed, the lining of his intestines will shed, lining of the bladder will shed, and they all have a little bit of iron. A man will lose 1 milligram, and a woman as well will lose that same amount. However, if you think about a woman who's still cycling, she's going to lose a little bit more blood. Her numbers average out to 1.5 milligrams per day. We do have a deficit naturally. There's nothing we can do about it. That's why dietary iron is so important. We need to replenish that. We need to eat foods that have iron, supplement with iron if needed. If you can imagine our patient with Crohn's, he is losing all this blood through his intestinal tract and losing the blood, but losing the red blood cells and then losing that iron that's in there. Now, there's something else, because you could think, well, why doesn't he just take more iron? The thing is that there's another problem that comes along with the inflammation. We're losing 1 milligram per day, 1.5 if you're a woman, and then we're adding it back through our intestinal tract. And so I did this one rendering once when I taught this. If you can imagine a sink, like a bathroom sink. So suppose we have a bathroom sink, and that's where we're going to put our iron in. So that represents the body's iron amount. And we can either add to it through a faucet that we can turn on and off. So we can either increase the flow, turn it off completely, slow it down. And then at the other end, we have a drain, like a typical drain. With iron, we can adjust the faucet. So we can increase how much we absorb, we can decrease it. But with getting it out of the body, we cannot touch that. That is a drain that is set, either 1 or 1.5 if you're a woman. Once iron's in, it's not coming out naturally. So let's say you had too much iron if you have one of these diseases, like let's say hemochromatosis. Someone has hemochromatosis or someone doesn't, they still will excrete the same amount of iron, 1 or 1.5 milligrams. The only way they can get it out is by seeing a phlebotomist who will take out a volume of blood out of their body. They'll remove the blood, red blood cells, and thus their iron. Since we know that about the body, there's no way to get iron out. Regulating the intake is very, very meticulous. So the body knows I only can pull in what I need. And so that faucet is regulated. So I hope that metaphor made sense. I know someone wrote in here that was a great metaphor. The only thing the body can control is what we take in, the faucet. And that's done through everything that we eat, and that's done through cells in our small intestine. Now, one of the biggest regulators is a protein called hepcidin, and hepcidin is made by the liver. So the liver is actually one of the kings of hematology. The liver makes proteins that help us clot blood. Hepcidin is this very, very important protein, and we're going to circle back to why it's important in this case. Hepcidin, if it's released, its job is to decrease iron levels. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. So side means like kill. It's going to kill the iron levels. So if we have hepcidin around, we're not going to absorb iron. We don't want it in the blood. Now, with inflammation and inflammatory conditions like Crohn's, that inflammation will drive hepcidin production. So in our patient who has Crohn's, who is already losing all this blood, who is losing all this iron, their body is also making more hepcidin. It's telling the body don't absorb iron, even though the body needs it. And there was a study that was done that took a bunch of people who did not have Crohn's, and then they compared it to people who had Crohn's, and they checked their hepcidin levels, and the hepcidin levels were increased in Crohn's. So we've got two things here that is driving the iron down. It's the loss and the lack of absorption. So the answer to this question, the first one, is our patient has an iron deficiency anemia. Why do progenitor red blood cells stop producing hemoglobin? There are a few reasons. One is iron. The bone marrow is a very lean machine, meaning it works in a very lean way. So it's not going to go through all this trouble to make hemoglobin, which has the globins. Those are going to be our big proteins. It's got a little, it's got porphyrin rings on there on each of those, and then it puts an iron last. So it's not going to go through all this trouble, make it, and then at the very end be like, uh-oh, I don't have iron. So iron is one of the things that will regulate how much hemoglobin is made. Love hematology is amazing. Hematology is my number one. Hematology and GI, and they're pretty much linked together, which reminds me, we have another question to do. So we have the same patient who has Crohn's. He had worsening symptoms, and then he had a portion of his terminal ileum removed, and we took out 45 centimeters of his ileum, and then now it's 2 years after that. He's doing really well, and he hasn't had bloody diarrhea or a flare in 18 months. Colonoscopy shows that things have quieted down. His inflammation has quieted down, and so he has his blood work repeated, and so we have the same things to look at. We have our RBC count, which is now 4.1 million cells per microliter, so that's low. It's lower than before. And then our MCV now has changed. Remember, it was below 80 in the first case, but now we're at 107, so that's high. And then we have a hematocrit of 44%. We have an anemia, and it's macrocytic because we have an MCV that's 107, so that's over 100. They're too big. These cells are just way too big. So we can knock out the answer choice of normal lab work because it's not normal. So now we're left with, let's see, iron deficiency anemia. We can knock that out because the MCV is way too high. Remember, iron deficiency is going to be a microcytic anemia. So microcytic meaning smaller than normal, and that's because we have less hemoglobin in there because of that really amazing question that someone asked about the progenitor cells. So we're left with two choices, B12 and folate deficiency. Now, to answer this, I want to talk about the small intestine. We're talking about 20 feet of intestines. Who does the visuals for videos? I do. I became a 3D artist after I left hospital work. Oh, cool. I really enjoyed them. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoy them. I'm making a lot of interesting stuff coming up. So small intestine, 20-ish feet. That comes to 600 centimeters roughly. So some people have more, like longer intestines. Some people have shorter intestines. But for our purposes, let's just say it's 600 centimeters. And we have three parts to the small intestine. The first part, that's coming right after the stomach. So when you think about it, you eat something, it goes through your esophagus into your stomach. The next step is the duodenum. So that's the first part of the small intestine. That's the shortest one. So the duodenum is the first part, 25 centimeters. Then after that, the kind of mid part of the small small intestine is jejunum, and that's at 200 centimeters. And the last part before we hit the colon, the ileum, is going to be 300 centimeters. And I promise there's a point to all this. This is an intersection of GI and anemia. Small intestine is extraordinarily important. It is actually the spot in the digestive tract where most of the nutrient absorption happens. The small intestine has different locations where it likes to absorb things. Iron gets absorbed in the first parts, so the duodenum and the upper jejunum. Same with folate. B12, on the other hand, is actually absorbed towards the end, so that's going to be in ileum. Knowing that anatomy will help you figure out, could the patient have a problem in absorbing in any of those areas? With our patient here, we took out 45 centimeters of ileum. We took out a spot where we absorb B12, and I looked up a paper, and I read that there is a risk, once you've taken out 20 centimeters of ileum, you have a risk of B12 deficiency. And so in this case, with 45 centimeters taken out, which could be 1/6 of his ileum. Like, it sounds like it's small, but it's not. It's 1/6 of the area where we take up our B12. Considering that, considering his history, considering that he has a high MCV, the answer to this question is B12 deficiency. And I think that was, yeah. So folate, I mean, it's always possible. However, remember, folate is absorbed in a different location, and that is in the duodenum and the upper jejunum, and we did not remove that.